Welcome back to the PRI Digital Forum. No matter what issues an institutional investor prioritizes, one difficulty for all of us is sourcing the best data to inform our decisions. To tell us more about this and introduce our next group of panelists, here is the PRI's Director of Sustainable Markets, Morgan Slebos.
Thank you, Carol, and welcome everyone who is joining us for the session on driving meaningful data, where we will explore ESG data challenges facing investors, solutions that are gathering pace internationally and in North America. As Carol said, my name is Morgan Slebos, and I'm joined by three leading experts who I'd like to introduce onto the panel. Joining us from Canada, we have Aaron Bennett, Managing Director, Sustainability Investment Strategy and Research. Aaron is a member of the Research and Portfolio Management team committed to supporting the continuous improvement of systemic and robust integration of material ESG factors into the investment analysis across portfolios and asset classes. In addition, he is tasked with advising and supporting the Investment Strategy Committee in broader policy formulation and implementation, and Aaron is also a member of the firm's Sustainable Investment Committee. Next on the panel, joining us from the US, is Catherine Banat. Catherine is Director of Responsible Investing at RBC Global Asset Management. Catherine oversees the responsible investing platform in the US. As an ambassador of the value proposition associated with responsible investing and the strategic approach of RBC, she champions ESG and impact investing with clients and prospects. Catherine is a keen advocate of responsible investing within the broader investment community as a resource to asset owners and advisors seeking to expand their understanding of ESG integration and impact investing. Also joining us from the US is Samantha Ross, who is one of the founding staff of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board and helped build it from the ground up in its first 15 years. She contributed to building the world's largest and most respected audit oversight institution and achieving long-term positive incremental change to make audits more transparent and relevant to investors. She founded AssuranceMark to continue to serve investors' interest in high-quality, reliable reporting and assurance on material disclosures beyond the financial statements. Welcome all, and thank you for joining us. Aaron, Catherine, Sam, before we hear from each of you, I would like to start with some brief scene setting, if I may. Driving meaningful data throughout markets is a key priority for PRI. The flow of comparable data from corporations and reliable data through the investment chain is critical to the ability of investors to take into account material ESG risk and opportunities, and increasingly to understand corporate and investor activity in meeting sustainability goals. However, PRI signatories state that ESG data is a particular concern, citing consistency, comparability, and quality as a substantial barrier to their own practices. And these challenges that investors face with ESG data include harmonization of corporate reporting and fragmentation of data for investment decisions. I think these challenges are well understood and documented, and progress on resolving them has been somewhat limited to date. But during 2020, I think there's been various initiatives, regulatory developments, and calls for action internationally, which have resulted in a groundswell of support for change in sustainable reporting. The principal among these, on the standard setting front, we have seen the IFRS Foundation trustees consulting on setting up a Sustainability Standards Board to set global sustainability standards with a climate-first approach. Voluntary standard setters such as GRI and SASB IIC have issued a statement of intent on their collaboration to progress towards a more comprehensive corporate reporting system. We've also seen initiatives like the World Economic Forum and International Business Council issue a standardized set of common metrics for corporate reporting. On the regulatory front, we've also seen the International Organization of Security Organizations establish a Sustainable Finance Task Force to develop a cohesive, transparent, and standardized form of sustainability disclosures. Several markets are also now introducing and moving towards mandatory TCF disclosures, and Europe has also undertaken an in-depth review of its non-financial reporting requirements. I think institutional investors are, together with preparers, cited as a driving force behind these calls for clearer, consistent, and comparable sustainability information, demanding better disclosure of climate risk and also sustainability indicators. These efforts are a significant step towards a globally harmonized and adopted system. However, these efforts are being driven to a certain extent outside of North America, and it remains to be seen how these developments will influence and align with market developments and approaches in your markets. During the session today, we'll explore, I think, the specific drivers of ESG data needs in both Canada and the US markets, the direction that Canadian and US market and regulatory developments are taking to resolve data challenges, and how these are aligned or not with international developments. I will invite each of our panelists to provide some remarks and discussion, followed by questions from the audience. And to the audience, we want to address your questions as well, so please send questions throughout the session. Aaron, if I may, I'd like to hand over to you to provide some brief remarks on the Canadian perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Morgan. I think from the Canadian perspective, when we think about our role in the world and why we need to engage there, I think we've come to realize that standards are being set in the context of other regions and economies, and that may certainly work to some extent for us, but it may not recognize some of the special elements or unique elements of Canada or similarly resource-based economies. And we need to engage. We need to maintain relevance and have a voice at that table. And we have to have a really good framework and data and disclosure framework around that to do that. What are we doing in Canada? I think we're moving in the right direction, and I think we're relatively advanced compared to some, but clearly a lot of work to do. We have a carbon price, as opposed to a large percentage of the emissions in the world. We have a carbon price that is far above the average, which is too low. The average is $2 a ton. We're at 15 to 20, depending on the province. And that covers about 45 to 85% of the emissions of any individual province. So that's good. We've also made net zero in Paris commitments, although there certainly is some room for greater ambition and substance to those commitments as well. But that does guide some of the policy development and regulatory nature. Within the capital markets, we have some basic guidance right now that doesn't really constrain the disclosure on ESG. To some extent, it encourages it, but it's not very specific. But we are seeing many consultations with regulators and exchanges talking about minimum standards and efforts. They tend to be coalescing really around TCFD and SASB right now. There's a lot of efforts as well on the, outside of that, in the community, in the investment community, in the financial community, including transition taxonomy. Our central bank is making some efforts with regards to scenarios, and even some collaborative initiatives around engagement and things like that for Canadian companies. I mean, we really need to reflect the unique elements of Canada, and in some senses, they're obvious. We're a resource-based economy, and we have a high proportion of emissions in the energy space. But that also means that we need to recognize that energy element as well, and think about things like the just transition. But we also have a vibrant economy outside of energy, and we need to think about those. Sometimes we get too caught up in thinking about scenarios for the energy side of the equation and disclosures for energy companies where emissions and the materiality is more obvious. And we really need to push beyond that and find scenarios and disclosures that are relevant to other industries and really go beyond the oil and gas side of things. So overall, I'd say the state of disclosure in Canada is progressing in a positive direction. Some work to do here, but some really interesting and emerging frameworks and some tools to help us with that.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. If I might just pick up a few points in that, I think, which is you talk a lot about the unique drivers, I think, of the Canadian economy. What specific disclosures are you really looking for an investor to come through from the frameworks?
Yeah, I think there's two sides of this. I think we have to recognize the idiosyncratic risks and opportunities, and I think for companies where climate change is clearly and immediately and obviously material to their value creation mechanism. So energy companies, utility companies, renewable companies, high emitters, or solutions companies, so to speak. I think we have to think about those companies in a different way than some of the others. And so for those companies where their materiality is very high, I think, we need to see things like scope 1 and 2 emissions. We need to see, strategy and accountability and resilience through a variety of scenarios, because I think anybody in the investment industry will clearly tell you the future is very difficult to predict, and we need to be open to an evolving and very dynamic future. For companies that are outside of that clearly material, they still need to disclose. There is this systemic element of the risk and opportunities associated with climate change that we need to recognize as capital markets participants, and therefore the companies, as well as ourselves, the asset managers and asset owners, need to have some minimum level of disclosure around things like emissions and strategies as well. But I would certainly set the bar a little bit lower with regards to that group relative to the energy intense group or the emissions intense and solutions group.
I just want to pick up on two, I think, initiatives that you sort of mentioned. I think one is really around the role of investor company engagement as a key channel to aligning disclosures, particularly around sort of TCFD. Are you able to sort of comment on that work in Canada and how that's playing out?
Yeah, I think it's still very much emerging. Although I'd say there's a substantial group in the Canadian capital markets on the asset owner and asset manager side that were involved with and saw the success of the Climate 100 Plus, and thought this was great, but it really only caught a couple of the larger Canadian companies. So there's a lot more to cover in the Canadian universe, including some small and mid-cap companies that really make up a really important piece of our overall economy. So there's a lot of thought behind how can we take the approach of Climate 100 as a collaborative engagement to one, express the views of investors, long-term investors interested in the success of the Canadian markets and the economy, and two, how do we support those companies in a way with meaningful ideas and expectations around these are the kinds of disclosures we want to see, this is the kind of frameworks that we're suggesting, and I think that it was quite interesting. The initial discussions around some of these elements were relatively informal, but it was pretty clear that most people were pretty supportive of the TCFD and SASB as a great way for companies to focus on the initial disclosures and really start making progress. And so that's been an interesting one, and I think an important one too, because the success of the Climate 100 Plus has been quite significant. And I think that they've provided a really good framework that can be adapted to the specifics of regional markets to really help show similar progress in markets such as Canada.
And just one other piece I want to pick up, which was that I think there's been some quite significant regulatory developments, I think yesterday from your central bank. I wonder if you're able to sort of speak briefly about that.
Yeah, it's exciting. We've been very fortunate of having a number of governors of our central bank that are quite progressively minded and very pragmatic about climate change. Including Mark Carney, who was one of the original backers of the TCFD and took an active role in that when he was over in the UK as well. More recently, our new governor of the central bank is Governor Tiff Macklin, who is also on our expert panel for sustainable finance. So, deeply involved in those kinds of initiatives. He's taken that sentiment and that direction to the central bank, and they've launched an initiative with OSFI, our main financial institution regulator, to really work on developing some different scenarios around climate change for the Canadian economy that can be applicable to what is generally seen as a difficult nut to crack for TCFD, and that's using these scenario analysis and applying it to non-energy companies, and in particular financial institutions, where it's very complex. There's a lot of embedded emissions. There's a lot of indirect exposure. So how do you think about some of those things? Well, the central bank is in a great position, along with the OSFI, the central regulator, to really kind of do that and to push forward with some scenarios that provide us some indicators and some benchmarks and a range of scenarios that can help people think about the broader Canadian economy and perhaps their specific place within it. But it's also very exciting to see a central bank acknowledge the challenges in a practical way and really seek to solve it. So I think it's also exciting in that sense as well.
Great, thanks, Aaron. Catherine, if I could maybe invite you to make some brief remarks from the US perspective.
Sure. I just feel that it's important as a division of the Royal Bank of Canada to say that we are also excited about the developments in Canada, driven by the Canadian Central Bank, and are looking to figure out ways to use that as a model for things to come here in the US and throughout our other businesses. So I just wanted to salute that initiative. From a US perspective, while regulators are driving data solutions in many markets, the driver in the US tends to be more free market forces. What we see is that the market demand for data, disclosure, and transparency is quite powerful, and this is driving change. This demand is coming from investors and from customers in both the B2B world and in the B2C world. In addition, in 2020, I think we've all been painfully reminded that the world we live in is intensely interconnected. And corporations and investors are really no exception. They all operate globally. A US asset manager is as likely to have a European client as a US client. US corporations' investors are global. So we believe that regardless of where we are today on data and standards, we will all eventually end up in the same place.
Great. Can I delve a bit more into that? And just with Catherine, in terms of you talked about the B2B and B2C, I think you touched on the European driver, and also what demands are you sort of seeing from your institutional clients for data and on reporting on ESG?
Well, I think it's really what we're demanding. We as investors are demanding that corporations provide a lot of data, and we work with companies through engaging to gather information about all ESG factors. The most, I think, talked about is board composition, but it goes across the E and S and G spectrum, and we've all seen a lot of interest in data around the S, that both as investors ourselves and from our clients. So we also look at sort of where a company is today and what its plans are, and we use that engagement to understand its sort of plan for moving. Aaron talked about the transition economy. How are you going to take advantage of that or participate in that? And we track that and look to see if a company is moving along that spectrum. What all of that does is it creates a lack of standards for the corporations and their sustainability officers are essentially getting crushed by the volume of requests and the lack of standardization. So when we talk about free market forces, we see that corporations are really looking for standards around disclosures to reduce the burden of that reporting on them. From the B2B perspective, to speak more specifically about that, suppliers are being asked for a lot of ESG information. And we as a small cap investor often go to companies and ask them about their ESG or sustainability practices. And at first, they don't know what we mean. We then both realize that this is the information that their customers, the corporations to whom they are suppliers, are looking to fill out supplier data around sustainability for investors such as ourselves. And that corporate reporting is driving the small cap companies to have to come up from a B2C perspective with a greater focus on what they're doing in terms of sustainability and ESG. And then I think from the B2C perspective, customers increasingly want sustainable products, and they want to buy from sustainable companies. And we've seen a tremendous amount of growth in sales for products labeled sustainable here in the US. And we think this will also lead to transparency in ESG data over time as companies increasingly recognize the value of ESG as a competitive advantage in the marketplace. So we see all of these forces combining to drive towards standardization, and we're hoping it's going to create a race to the top.
And do you sort of see some of, I think in terms of standardization, do you see it coalescing around any of the sort of frameworks that are helping you?
We at RBC are certainly supporting the TCFD and SASB initiatives that Aaron referred to. And, it really helps when you're all pushing on the same thing in the same direction and not diverging. And that works for the standardization. But from an investor perspective, as on behalf of our clients, digging deeper and that real individual one-on-one information and fundamental research on these factors and considerations that we put into our portfolios, we see that as a competitive advantage. So in some ways, we benefit a little from the lack of standardization as well, but do support standardization in some frameworks and formats.
And also one more question I want to follow up on, which was we talked about, I think, the SASB and TCFD, and I think a lot of this around ESG sort of integration perspectives. But I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on the direction of travel on the need for impact reporting for investors in the US. I mean, these are quite live discussions internationally, and we're seeing a growing need for impact and ESG disclosures. Is that sort of playing out in the US?
Well, I think it's playing out everywhere, right? It's hard to ignore that it's probably playing out everywhere. But I think we're still at the early stages, and outcomes data is even harder than inputs, right? You can sort of standardize inputs, but outcome data is different, and I see that as complicated. Because not only is the data not there, and standardization, but the needs of each client can be different. So some European pension plans are driving and leading a lot on the output data. And we're seeing a growing interest, and we expect this to continue to accelerate. But they're not agreeing on what it is they want and what it is they're looking for. Certainly, SDG reporting is starting to help standardize that a little bit, and it's growing in relevance. And many of the in the US, a lot of the large brokerage platforms, for example, are looking for SDG reporting. And again, but these are often customized. And so asset managers are providing some customization of reporting. At RBC, we recognize the value of SDG reporting early on, and we've built some products leading to an expertise in SDG alignment and reporting, and some very interesting proprietary tools.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. I'm just going to hand over to Sam now. Sam, we've heard from the investor perspective in the US. I'd be keen to hear your perspective, particularly around sort of regulatory developments. Obviously, in light of the election last week, it's hard to ignore what potentially could be on the regulatory calendar or agenda. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Morgan. It's a very exciting time right now for sustainable investing. In regulation. Of course, we have nothing nearly as exciting to report so far as Aaron has had about what's happening in Canada. But I think there are very good prospects for sustainability reporting and disclosure post-election here in the U.S. There was some discussion about that, I know, in the last panel. I'll hazard to say we're even seeing some bipartisan support. Today, the outgoing chairman of the SEC, Chairman Jay Clayton, testified before the Senate Banking Committee and said that he believes that there should be ESG disclosure. He'd like to see it be very high level and principles based. But it was the first time he'd actually come out and said that. And of course, the SEC to date hasn't done anything in that area. So it's a little interesting coming out at the very end of his tenure saying that, but it's very helpful because it's obviously going to be something on the agenda going forward. And it's nice to see that there is at least some commonality in understanding that it's very important. You mentioned, Morgan, the IOSCO initiative. I would expect that to be very important here in the U.S. The SEC is part of IOSCO. They have been, and he testified to this today, actually, the SEC has been behind the scenes, as they normally are with IOSCO, working on the initiative. So I would expect that to play some role here in the US. But I think it's going to actually be a lot bigger what we see here. There's a lot of pent-up demand for disclosure about sustainability, disclosure about climate change, disclosure about human capital. And I think that being the large market that we are, I think that we will see from a regulatory perspective, a really strong focus and a really robust process to come up with some standardized disclosures that will help investors and help markets. So I think it will be a very exciting time. Now, that said, I don't want it to be lost that there's another very important, somewhat overlooked area, and that is enforcement of existing disclosure and accounting rules. Because, of course, we already have a lot of rules that cover this space. In 2010, the SEC came out with a release on climate change and very carefully walked through how the existing accounting and disclosure rules under the SEC's MD&A disclosure framework, how that applies to climate change. And we've had several different, it was 10 years ago, we've had several different reports over the years looking at how that's going. And in general, our Government Accountability Office and other groups that have looked at what's happened have found that that release essentially just wasn't enforced, in large part because of SEC budget constraints. The SEC has had difficulty allocating resources to the file reviews that the Division of Corporation Finance normally goes through, that has a huge impact on helping companies see where they really need to improve their disclosure. And companies care a lot about when the SEC asks them questions. I think that's going to all change. I think that'll change probably immediately in the new term. The resources will be reallocated, and we're going to start to see more robust sustainability-related disclosures in existing 10Ks and financial statements, as we are also talking about building out more uniform, standardized frameworks for disclosure. But finally, the one thing I do want to touch on, and I know we'll probably talk about this going forward as well, but reliability is a very key issue. Throughout the process of considering a new disclosure framework to incorporate sustainability data, it's going to be very important to also consider the tools we have to make sure that that disclosure is reliable. And I think third-party assurance is going to be a very key tool in that regard. Many of these disclosures, as we've been discussing already, are fairly new to companies and fairly thin today. And we don't really have a better tool than third-party assurance to get sort of behind the scenes with the company, looking at the company's own data and kind of probing and asking questions to drive more rigor in the process and then deliver investors more accurate and reliable data. So I think that will be very key to stay in the picture as we discuss how we move forward and creating these new disclosures.
Mm-hmm. Can I just ask, I think, a question you sort of mentioned briefly on the IOSCO initiative, maybe just for our audience who probably aren't quite familiar with IOSCO, kind of what role what they're doing at the moment and how they might play into the SEC, maybe if you could elaborate on that.
Sure. So IOSCO is the International Organization of Securities Regulators. It's been around for a very long time. Worldwide securities regulators are members of it. And it's been an important body to consider, standardized approaches to various topics over the years. It's not specifically focused on sustainability, but earlier this year, they announced a project to consider, globally more sustainable disclosure practices. Now, this is a securities regulator. It's not the same thing as like SASB or GRI, or even the potentially new sustainability standards board that the IFRS Foundation has vetted earlier, about a month ago, put out a concept release on. But IOSCO has a very important role in driving sort of what's the, I don't mean this pejoratively at all, but what's the floor of what regulators worldwide should be requiring. It tends to deal in kind of much broader frameworks and try to pull forward countries that may be, have less developed frameworks. I think that, the SEC is a major player in that organization. I think that will have an impact. But like I said, we just had an election, climate change, human capital, sustainability, all, were very important issues in our election. I think that, we're probably going to work with, use what IOSCO is working on, be deeply involved in it, but then also be very involved in our own process to build out more uniform, comparable, consistently stated disclosures.
Just one more question, I think, really around sort of, I think, the IFRS development, which you touched on.
Yeah.
Obviously, IFRS is quite important, I think, in international jurisdictions, but perhaps less so in Canada and the US, which used, I think, different accounting standards. So maybe a reflection on how influential that might be or might not be in these markets.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, it's super interesting to see what the IFRS Foundation has proposed. And of course, Nick Anderson, one of the board members on the IASB, about a year ago came out with a fantastic paper on how existing accounting standards already apply to the climate disclosure in the financial statements. But this past, I think it was the very end of September, the IFRS Foundation, which is the board that oversees the International Accounting Standards Board, the IFRS Foundation put out a concept release asking what the public broadly all over the world thinks about the idea of establishing a sustainability standards board that would sit alongside the International Accounting Standards Board to develop sustainability sustainability disclosure standards. So it's very exciting. It'll be interesting to see how it relates to the IASB standards. And I personally think that a through line between the sustainability disclosures that any new board like that writes will through line into the financial statements will be really important. That's what the IFRS Foundation really brings to that. That said, the IFRS standards don't apply for the most part in U.S. securities filings. Many people may not realize, though, that there are numerous foreign private issuers that file with the SEC because they offer securities here in the United States. And those companies are allowed to file under IFRS, file their financials according to IFRS standards. So IFRS does exist in our market. Many of the largest companies in the world are listed here and file IFRS financial statements. So it may impact us if the new Sustainability Standards Board is very tied to the IASB, such that the standards are kind of so intertwined that the filings companies make, the financial statements the companies write and then file here would be incorporating those sustainability disclosures from that board. I think it also has another impact too, though. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I'm just going to pause you there. I just realized that we're already at the half an hour mark, and this is a really great conversation. I just wanted to actually just, bring Catherine back in here and hear your sort of thoughts, because you talk about the sort of obviously the market-led developments, but obviously I'd like to hear your reflections as an investor with the potential regulatory agenda that might be emerging under a new administration, and what your thoughts are on that.
It's so hard to predict things in the U.S. these days. And I think it's absolutely arrogant to think that you can. What I will comment, there are a couple of things that I want to comment on, picking up on some of the things Sam said, so I'll integrate them a little bit. There is a clear signal from this Biden and Harris administration that there will be a focus on ESG and that it will be high on the priority list. There is a strong sense that a lot of the things that have been reversed from the Obama administration during the Trump administration will be reestablished as quickly as possible and as quickly as the wheels of bureaucracy allow us to do. So high on the agenda, and I think certainly high on the consistent messaging. I think that's really how I would put it. But I really think that, Sam said something that I think it's really prompted a thought in me, which is this idea of enforcement. And I really want to drive home that regulation is terrific, but we really shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there is a true economic imperative and value proposition in this. It is, so when you say something, you say enforcement, really making sure that the disclosures are accurate and that the information that is being shared in financial statements are accurate is in some ways the most important thing I see we could do from a regulatory standpoint. We are talking about a green economy, however you want to do that. There will be huge investment opportunities as a result of that. And we need stimulus, we need ideas, we need a new place to sort of reinvigorate our economy. So I think there are economic drivers here, and the real role of regulation is of regulation, the primary role it could do is monitor and enforce and make sure that it's accurate. And that being said, I agree there will be lots of other places where regulation starts to be changed or redirected with the new administration.
I think while we're on at that point of, I think, enforcement, I think also partly covers into sort of assurance. I want to bring in a question from the audience here, which is back to sort of Sam's point, which is what about the cost and time required for third-party assurance, and how hard it's hard to get a few metrics, let alone a full report covered. Just wondered if anyone to sort of invite anyone to comment on that question.
I think from our perspective, it's a really important one because this is a very competitive marketplace as an asset manager, and it's becoming increasingly competitive. And so I think we need to consider, certainly when we ask companies, is this where we want them to be allocating time and resources and capital? And when clients come to us and ask for similar information, I think there has to be that question that says, is this where you want us to be allocating our time and resources and capital? And I think in the case of when you're talking about items that are material to the value creation mechanism of a company, I think the justification can be there for, as Catherine and Sam outlined, that idea of verifying that the information produced is reliable and accurate and things like that. I think that's a really good thing. But I think having broad, third-party verification of, all sorts of disclosures that may or may not be useful to investors and may or may not be useful to other parties. I think that's something where you really have to sort of think about that. And we certainly sympathize with the companies that are being hit with a bit of survey fatigue. So I think that there is a role to play, but I do think that we have to consider the resource allocation as well.
I want to I agree with what Aaron's saying, but I also want to add a different lens to it, if I may. We shouldn't leave out the value of scalability. So standardization will allow more scalability, because there will be more corporations and that need to run the data and provide the data, and it'll be more standard, which will allow a lot of this third-party verification to be more systematic and more technology-driven. And secondly, the more there's a demand and there are more dollars for it, the more scalable all of those services and systems can become. So we should, I encourage us to keep scalability on the list of again, what can happen here as we drive forward in what is really an evolution. Maybe it should be a revolution, but it's an evolution.
Absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with what Catherine and Aaron have just said. Both have spoken to the problem of survey fatigue. I think that's in part driven by the fact that disclosures that investors are getting aren't really satisfying their needs, and that can be, and the only tool we have currently is to just say I'd like more disclosure, and of course more disclosure creates that fatigue. I think if we can get to a system where we actually have, as Catherine says, scalable platform of fairly consistent disclosures. There can be some special ones for different industries, but there should be disclosures we can have across the board. I think assurance is going to be a really key tool to make sure that companies are actually accurate and are rigorous in their processes. We really don't have a better tool. I mean, as we see, the SEC doesn't really have the resources to look deeply at every company. That's what an auditor does. It is cost effective in the financial statement arena. Of course, no company will probably tell you that they love paying auditors. It's not something that they necessarily feel the benefit of in the short term, but it's really the market as a whole that benefits, and that benefits both investors and companies everywhere. And it's worked very well in the financial statement context.
Great, thanks, Sam. I realize we've got a minute and a half left. I've got no idea how this time has just flown by. So I want to say, I think, if I could just sort of sum up the conversation so far, I think what I'm hearing is a lot of positive developments in the Canadian market around the regulatory efforts. We should be encouraged by market developments and drivers in the US, and we should also be optimistic about for the potential regulatory agenda that might emerge under a new administration in the US. With our minutes, well, our final minute, I would like to perhaps invite each of my panelists, if you'd like to offer a final message that you think that we would like to leave with the audience and they should take home with them. Sam, I'll start with you.
Okay, great. Well, I just would echo what I've just said, which is that watch this space. I think we will see some real improvement. I think it's going to be very important for investors to stay deeply engaged. Once the U.S. starts getting into more regulation, a lot of different kinds of players come in, and I think the investor voice it's going to be really important for the investor voice to be heard.
Great, thanks, Sam. Catherine.
There's a value proposition here. It's an economic value proposition, and everything else is going to have to fall into place to follow that.
Great, thank you. And Aaron, in our final 20 seconds.
Absolutely. I'd say progress over perfection. This is a journey for both sides, issuers and investors, and I think it's important to treat it as such and look for incremental progress and big jumps in progress when you can, but not to be necessarily holding things up because you're not seeing perfection as it stands, because there's lots more to come.
Great, thanks. And finally, just to say thank you to the panelists for joining us. It's been a fantastic discussion, and to the audience for joining us. And now I'll hand back to Carol.
Thank you, Morgan. For those of you who have pre-registered to attend a breakout, we are now going to split into 3 breakout sessions. Please make your way there now by navigating to the Agenda tab and selecting the session, and they'll begin in just a few minutes. If you are unable to pre-register to your preferred breakout session, please don't worry, as recordings of all sessions will be posted online here on the event website. We'll be back here in 1 hour with an update for all PRI signatories on the updated reporting framework.